You are listening to Down Home. I was struggling to find a way to open this episode, and I decided to use our guest's own words. So here's an excerpt from his book. In addition to facing racist epithets, verbal threats, or physical assaults, most of the white-owned restaurants, cafes, women's hair salons, and men's barbershops would openly refuse to provide any goods or services to the black citizens. When a black person requested service at these establishments, the owners or staff would brazenly state that they did not serve or want black people in their businesses. I wouldn't blame you if you thought that this author was writing about his experiences in the Jim Crow era of the southern United States. But no. The passage I just read is from Jim Crow Also Lives Here, a book written by Leonard Paris about his time growing up in rural Nova Scotia in the 1950s and 60s. We as Black Nova Scotians have a vibrant and rich history here in Canada, a history that dates back well over 300 years. It's also a complicated history, fraught with segregation and racism. For some of our listeners, it might sound odd to say that Canada has a history of segregation. I have to admit that it feels uncomfortable talking about this. It's the Canadian way to think that some of the systemic issues that plague our neighbors to the south aren't here, but they are. In this episode, Jay and I have a conversation with Mr. Len Paris, the author of Jim Crow Also Lived Here. Welcome to Down Home, the Nova Scotian experience from two black men. I'm Derek Wise, and as always, we have Jay Jones.
What's happening?
And our conversation this week is with author Len Paris. Mr. Paris, how are you today?
I'm fine. Thank you for having me this evening.
Oh, thank you. Thank you very much for giving us a little bit of your time to talk about your book, Jim Crow Also Lives Here. In talking about your book, actually, Nova Scotia has been described as the Mississippi of the North, and your book actually makes reference to that, and it conveys that sentiment. It does. Can you talk about growing up in New Glasgow and why that Mississippi reference was prevalent then and maybe it still is prevalent today?
Well, yes. I was actually born in Truro, which is about 40 miles from New Glasgow.
Right.
And when I was 6 years old, my parents moved to New Glasgow. My mom was from Truro. My dad was from New Glasgow, and he worked in New Glasgow. So the family made the move to New Glasgow when I was 6 years old. That was in 1954.
Right.
And at that time, I mean, there was no such thing at that time as nice racism. It was very open, very in your face, and you faced it. You faced it daily on the way to school. You faced it in the schoolyard, and sometimes even with your interaction with the teaching staff. There was clearly, a racist element there. New Glasgow itself, just to give you a little descriptor of it, at the time, it was a town of about 8,000 people. But it has four surrounding towns around it. So in all, Pictou County, in which New Glasgow is situated, has 5 towns. And the only town in that time, in the 1950s and 60s, the only town that black folks could live in was the town of New Glasgow. Mm-hmm. They could not live in the surrounding 4 towns at all. They couldn't rent there. They could not buy housing there. And so I lived in New Glasgow. I actually lived just outside of the town limit. So when it came time to go to high school, I had to go to the rural high school about 15 miles. I shouldn't be using miles. I should be using kilometers, but 15 miles from my home. But I did do my elementary schooling in a little little village on the border of New Glasgow called Priestville.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
But we had to go to New Glasgow for everything, for shopping. And,
Mm-hmm.
if you wanted to go to a movie, there weren't many places you could go, really. I mean, most of the restaurants were segregated at that time, not by law, but by practice.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
They didn't have the signs out there like you see in the United States in the
Mm-hmm.
50s and 60s. The signs are right there. The signs are very prominent. But in New Glasgow, there was places, if you tried to go into certain restaurants or a barber shop, hair salon, coffee shops, somebody would meet you at the door.
Right.
And they would tell you very, very brazenly that at that time they used the term colored people or Negro or Negroes at that time. We don't serve Negroes. We don't serve colored people. And sometimes they may even use the N-word in turning you away. So it was quite brazen. It was quite open. Yes.
So that it's almost like an unspoken segregation, right?
Yes.
So it was very, very much practiced, but not legislated in Nova Scotia. It's interesting because, like me and Jay, we grew up in Halifax. I didn't hear a lot of those stories from my grandparents. But in saying that, like my family, we grew up around the Creighton Street area, which at that time in the 50s and 60s was predominantly Black. So everything was self-sustained. Mm-hmm. Do you think that unspoken segregation was really predominant in like the rural areas of Nova Scotia?
Well, yes. As a matter of fact, a lot of the historic Black communities in Nova Scotia, and I think there's like 52 historically Black communities, a lot of them were in rural areas.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Whether we're talking, Windsor or Hammonds Plains, Lucasville, and places that you're all familiar with, those were in rural areas. They weren't in cities.
Right.
And the same with like New Glasgow and my little village of Priestville. It was segregated housing. It was segregated schooling in Nova Scotia up till 1954. I think the last segregated school in Nova Scotia didn't close until 1954, 1956, somewhere in that era.
Mm-hmm.
The churches were segregated. As a matter of fact, a lot of the churches today are still segregated.
Yeah,
indeed.
The church I went to was the Second United Baptist Church in New Glasgow. Mm-hmm. And the reason it was called the Second United Baptist Church is because the white congregation went to the First United Baptist Church.
Right.
So we had to build our own church, and we called it the Second United Baptist Church.
Right.
Mm.
So, like I said, churches were segregated. My school was not segregated in the area I live, but there were segregated schools in Nova Scotia.
Mm-hmm.
And and we all know the story of Viola Desmond. We're not going to go into that because everybody knows that story. And that happened in my hometown in Glasgow, the Roseland Theater.
Yeah.
And even when I was growing up in the 50s and 60s, we were still relegated to the balcony area and could not sit on the main floor.
Mm-hmm.
Now,
in the 60s.
That did change in the mid-60s or in the mid-60s, but during the 50s, you had to sit up in the balcony area.
Yeah, it was still because Viola, that happened 10 years before Rosa Parks. So, you know, she was at the start of it, and Rosa was near the end when, Martin Luther King was, doing a lot of civil rights stuff in the States then. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Now, it's interesting because we don't talk. It's an uncomfortable conversation to talk about this unspoken segregation in Canada, because when you talk to people, they always talk about segregation and it's linked to the southern states. So I think these conversations are very important. They're uncomfortable because as Canadians, we always think we weren't like that. This didn't happen here. But yes, it did happen here. Obviously, from what you're telling us and what we've heard and what we've experienced anyway. But that's it's amazing. Now, What do you think were the detrimental effects of this unspoken segregation that persisted back then and probably persists to a certain degree now as well?
Well, I think there's a lot of effects. One of them is trauma and stress.
Mm-hmm.
Continuing trauma. I
Mhm.
mean, when you're faced with racism every day, it traumatizes a person.
Yeah.
I wrote my book as kind of a healing journey to help with some of that trauma of what happened to me when
Mhm.
I was in my formative years, my teenage years.
Mhm.
Mm-hmm.
So it definitely carries trauma with it. It carries day-to-day stress. You never know when you're with a group and somebody brings up the N-word or all of a sudden, go back to where you came from type of comments and or great, don't forget and say go back to Africa, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's things of that nature. So that causes stress. You carry that over to employment and housing, and healthcare and interaction with the police. And all that is a very, very heavy burden to carry
Mhm.
or to expect anybody to carry.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, it's it's a seed that was planted and it's still growing and still continues to grow, It's in it's in our world. Now you mentioned it was a healing journey for you to write this book, and obviously you've had some trauma seeing those things and being in those situations. Was that the main reason why you wrote the book?
Uh, well, first off, to be truthful with you, I did not intend to write a book.
Right.
Okay.
It started out as kind of notes to myself, right?
Mm-hmm.
Or if you will, a letter to myself, right?
Yeah.
And that typically happened at 3 or 4 in the morning when you couldn't sleep and you're thinking back about growing up and the poverty, the substandard housing at that time,
Mm-hmm.
and the racism and the segregation. And you're thinking about that and you start writing, you're trying to get it out of your head. And good way to get anything out of your head is put it down on paper.
Indeed.
So that's how I started out. And then after I had about 2 notebooks full of notes, I decided, well, what am I going to do with these 2 notebooks full of notes?
Mhm.
And that's when I decided to write a memoir, write my book, and I titled it "Jim Crow Also Lived Here" because I viewed the racism and the segregation at that time in the 50s and 60s, because that's the period I wrote about.
Mhm.
Mm-hmm.
I viewed that as very much like your earlier comment, Mississippi
Mhm.
or Alabama or Georgia. And the more and more I researched those areas and the Jim Crow laws, which were the segregation laws that came out after the American Civil War and after Reconstruction, I guess partly during Reconstruction.
Mhm.
And it just dawned on me that, I mean, I was looking for a title for my book anyhow, right? I couldn't think of the proper title, right? Like picking blueberries or cold winters just didn't seem to cut it, right? Something that we all identify with in Nova
Yeah, yeah.
Scotia, right?
Oh
Yeah.
yeah.
And so the more and more I researched like again the segregation in the United States, those laws were codified in most cases. In
Mhm.
Nova Scotia, they were not codified or put in the law, at
Mhm.
least in the 50s and 60s. In the 1700s, they were definitely codified, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that's what I decided. I'm going to call the book "Jim Crow Also Lived Here."
Mhm.
Mm-hmm.
And that's a term that Rocky Jones would often refer to Nova Scotia as also. And
Okay.
so, yeah, it's interesting that Jay's name is Jones because Rocky Jones is a civil rights hero in Nova Scotia.
Yeah. Rocky Jones is actually one of my relatives. Yeah.
Well, I was thinking that maybe, yes.
Yeah. Yeah. There's lots
Yeah.
of Joneses in Nova Scotia, but he was my great grandfather, Sidney Jones, was the half brother of Jeremiah Jones, who was
Yes.
Rocky Jones's great grandfather or
Yes.
grandfather.
Jeremiah Jones.
I didn't
Mhm.
see him a whole lot growing up. When I was coming up, I was sort of the last grandchild that my great grandparents raised. But earlier, in I guess the 70s and everything like that. My grandfather and Rocky were pretty close. I just didn't see him when I was growing up a whole lot. But,
so he's actually credited with, in the mid 1960s, early 1960s, he's credited with, starting the Black civil rights movement in Nova Scotia.
Yeah, very true.
And the Black United Front and things of that nature. Yes.
Yeah. It's so okay. So what was the community like for you in New Glasgow, the Black community that you can remember being that young age?
Yes, I talked about that a lot in my book. That the Black community was our saving grace.
Yes.
The Black community and the Black church, and that has persisted right till today.
Yes,
I mean the Black churches in Nova Scotia and also other places in Canada, but particularly Nova Scotia, because that was, we were the first Black settlers, refugees, and enslaved people in Canada were Nova Scotia.
Yes,
it was in Nova Scotia.
Yeah.
So.
Me and Jay, actually, our families went to the same church. So it was at the time it was called Cornwallis Street Baptist Church.
Oh yes.
Yeah. What's it called now, Jay? New Horizons.
New Horizons, I believe.
New Horizons. Yeah. So I guess they took the name off because Cornwallis wasn't a really great dude. But our families, that was the center of the community, was the church in Nova Scotia. Definitely, we are well aware of that. It was the meeting place on Sundays. That was where families got together and communed. It was you're right, saving grace. I have to agree.
It was. Yeah. I mean, and we drew a lot of strength from the church and from the community. And it's like, a well-known African proverb, right, is it takes a village to raise a child, right?
Yeah.
Well, growing up, it was like everybody was your auntie or your uncle or Mr. or Mrs. or whatever.
Yeah.
And if you misbehaved, your mom or dad was going to hear about it even before you got home.
Yeah.
It always surprised me because my mom never had a telephone. My dad never owned a car. And I could be out, doing something, not necessarily misbehaving, but just out and about.
Yeah.
And by the time I got home, she knew where I was, who I was with, what I was doing. Like, it always amazed me, like the grapevine in the Black community, right?
Oh yeah.
Now with the community in New Glasgow being as strong as it was, and you and your family gaining a lot of faith and strength from it, what made the decision for your family to leave Nova Scotia, having that? And what was it like when you got to Ontario? Were there still similar things, like there was like segregation, or what did you experience then?
Yeah, well, some of the families stayed. Actually, my mom and dad stayed in Nova Scotia. My older sister moved to Toronto. My brother joined the Canadian Army, and he was in Ontario and several other places, and United Nations peacekeeping, and he basically went right around the world. And he served in Africa also, in Somalia and other places in Africa. And then I have another brother who lives in the United States, and so, but that wasn't uncommon in Black families that they would move to Montreal or Toronto. I think I'm speaking to the converted here now, but they would move to Montreal and Toronto, places like that. The big thing was because of the overt racism in Nova Scotia. Not to say there's not racism in Quebec and Ontario, because there's lots and lots of documented cases in Montreal and Toronto of anti-Black racism, but it wasn't, it wasn't as in your face, if you will. And it's a bigger area, and more chance to, I shouldn't say blend in, because you really don't want to blend in, but more chance to seek out opportunities.
And was Ontario very multicultural back then as well? Like it is probably not like now, but
no. It wasn't until 1955, and that's not that long ago.
No, true.
That Canada actually opened up immigration to people from the Caribbean and to Africa and other countries where there were Black people.
Yeah.
I mean, you know, and so in terms of Toronto, I mean, Toronto was fairly non-Black, we'll say.
Yeah.
In the 50s and parts of the 60s. And it's only in the, you know, starting in the 60s, 70s, 80s that you had a large influx from the Caribbean.
Right. Yeah.
Prior to that, if somebody from the Caribbean wanted to come to Toronto or Ontario, women could come as domestic workers prior to after 1955. Not prior to, they couldn't come at all. Wow. And men could come if they wanted to work on the railway, or because they were British citizens, and most of the Caribbean, well, pretty all the Caribbean islands were British citizens. They could join the military and things like that. So we had a big influx for, you know, labor, railway porters, which is in vogue right now with the TV series.
Yeah, the CBC television show.
Yes.
Yeah, that's right.
The porters, isn't it?
Yeah, the porters, yes. But that's the sort of restrictions they put on people that were Black back then.
Yeah, the Toronto, or I should say Canada, prior to the period that you're talking about, like around 1950, Canada had a very stringent immigration policy. They didn't let a lot of people. I think basically the UK was open door, of course, because of its history. But if you came from other portions of the world that were poorer, there were no official refugee policies. They closed the doors. I think the most notable one of them closing doors was to the Jewish immigrants that wanted to leave Germany. Canada said no.
Yeah, that's right.
Canada said no. So they had a real closed door policy of immigration before the 1950s, which is actually quite surprising. But hey, that's our history, right?
Yeah, sure.
That's our history.
The Irish had a lot of trouble here too, like you know, coming over here too in that same time frame. So yeah.
Well, this is a awesome conversation, Mr. Paris. This we love having Scotian expats on to talk about their experiences, and you know, you've echoed that rich experience that being from Nova Scotia is, rich and complicated too. It's both. It is both. But thank you very much for your time. This has been great.
Well, thank you for having me. I really appreciate it.
Yeah. It's always good to hear someone's story, and even though somewhat tragic sometimes, being Black in Nova Scotia, that you could find some great inspiration and take yourself on a healing journey as well, because that's the other part of it, is we will experience this and we continue to experience it, but where are you going to put your energies to sort of heal and be able to blend and be able to sort of continue to tell those stories of resilience and strength, and it's from people like you that we sort of inherit that inspiration from.
Definitely.
So thanks for sharing your time.
Well, thank you for having me, and I think it's safe to say that the Black community in Nova Scotia, and you know, you can extend that to the Caribbean community here in Ontario, or the Haitian community in Quebec, they still look to each other and for strength and for support, because quite often you don't get it elsewhere.
Yeah, it's true. Yeah, we have to continue strength. Oh, one last question. Any plans on future books or anything like that?
No, I'm still very actively promoting this book. This past month has been extremely busy. Did quite a few online presentations.
That's great.
Book sales are still very, very good.
That's excellent.
And so, maybe next winter. I mean, we've all been kind of burdened down with COVID and lockdowns and restrictions, everything else. And
yeah,
I think once we free up our mind from some of the other things, it's something I may consider.
Yeah, that's good. That's good.
Breaking new ground, breaking new ground, breaking new ground, breaking new ground, breaking new ground.
You have been listening to Down Home. Subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts.
Breaking new ground, breaking new ground, breaking new ground, breaking new ground, yeah. On a high plateau, from the one down below to the future of the funk, getting lost in the flow. Contact with the spark magex. Now it's time to flex with the force from the soul, reaching all aspects, getting deep, no time to sleep as you reach your next phase.
The song Breaking New Ground from The Breakdown.
Breaking down the sum to one, feeling free, I just laugh with the joy of a beat boy, just kicking it live. A connection so strong, transcribed with the vibe like magic prescribed.